Okay, let's come down back together. Let's finish up with that question again. So I did do a quick look up here. It is the same exact word in Hebrew. So it can be in the range of meanings here for the Hebrew word sup. Okay, it can mean to snap at, figuratively, to break, to bruise, to cover, to crush, to seize upon, to strike out. Okay, or to bruise. And so, but I've always kind of looked at it in the sense of it's just part of my whatever memory process here. Is the word is the same. It can mean obviously a very big wide range of meanings, but the concept of bruising the heel, okay, it kind of sounds like it's not a mortal wound, but it can be because it obviously has that same connotation. But when you're talking about he shall bruise your head, I think there's a more intense connotation to what's being communicated there. But you're going to bruise his heel, the bottom of it. He's going to bruise your head. And so because of the range of meanings, I've always looked at it and always thought about it this way. And I don't know whoever quoted it this way outside of the commentaries, there's this crushing that goes on with Satan's head. Bruising works for both. And so it can be, there's a equal and opposite kind of things that are going on here. But I think it's really that there's going to be I think you might call it a bump in the road for the seed of the woman. You've got to have a heel bruised, and there's going to be a fatal into the serpent and what's going to happen to his seed in this bruising of the head or the crushing of the head. And so, obviously commentators and translators can use any range of meaning within that Hebrew word that they like. I've just myself always kind of just memorized it in a sense way. There's a bruising of the heel and a crushing of the head. Both, the term is the same, but it depends on what part of the thing that we're looking at here, especially as it relates to if the seed of the woman is Christ, then we're dealing with, adding on the information from Revelation that Satan will be ultimately destroyed. Whereas the seed of the woman, if Christ, he is obviously victorious in every way, although allowing himself to go to the cross and be bruised. So anyway, hope that helps, and I hope I didn't confuse anybody too much by making those statements the way I did. All right.
Do you think the people who are online understood the purpose of the definition?
Maybe not. Yeah, there was just a question about in verse 15. Thanks, Tim's asking about people online. In most translations, or some at least, use the exact same word for cruise versus, to bruise versus crush. I just have always, I can't remember even who originally communicated it that way, and I think it's always stuck with me. The bruising of the head or heel and crushing of the head has just really stuck with me for 25 years or more. So, but same Hebrew word, great big range of meanings, and I, like I said, I lean towards the idea that Satan is ultimately defeated by the seed of the woman, who is Christ, which he is, and so that gives you more semantical reason to use the word crush for what happens to the serpent's head or the seed of the serpent. Okay, as I said, Satan wasn't offered any hope to be himself to be redeemed, but there is hope for the woman and the woman's seed and for all of mankind. So there is something great that comes from this. So the road to the victory for mankind through the seed of the woman will not be easy or casualty free. There's that bruising of the heel. But God has given absolute assurance of victory in the end, even here in this one single verse, Genesis 3:15, and the bruising of the head and the bruising of the heel. Okay. So that transitions us out of the serpent. So that's what God said to the serpent. You got these 6 different curses that are, that are relative to the serpent and all of his kingdom and all that he will do. The consequences of curses are consequences, not curses for the woman. So the first thing I want you to notice as we transition from the serpent who was cursed directly is the woman is not cursed, she's experiencing consequences. God did not place a curse on woman, the mother of all living, Eve. He said these are going to be the consequences of your choices. Okay, big difference. And that'll become even more clear when we see Adam, who was also not cursed, but the ground is cursed because of him. We'll see that in a moment. All right, so that one single verse 16. Unlike the serpent, as I said, the woman is not cursed for her transgression. However, Yahweh declared that she, and I believe representative of all womankind, would suffer consequences that came as a result of Eve's actions in the gardens. Now, God does not condemn or hold, judicially declare that somebody is a child will suffer the sins of their parents. In fact, he specifically says they won't. But the consequences of what a parent does easily transfer to their children and their children's children in a multitude of ways. They end up in a level of consequences that are inescapable, unavoidable, and tend to descend down to children. Whether that's, you've lost all of your resources, you've gone bankrupt or whatever, and now your children will suffer because of that. God's not going to just keep your children unbankrupted while you go bankrupt. And we also see that with things like drug and alcohol abuse and all of that. If you're an alcoholic, there's a great chance that your children would follow, or even grandchildren would follow into that same sin. And so we're seeing the same thing here with a woman. There's going to be consequences that God declares on all of the female side of the human race that are part of her existence. Let's talk about that. So the consequence number one is God will multiply sorrow related to her conception. Okay. There's going to be sorrow related to her conception. Now, we live in the 21st century, and we might not be fully aware of both the historical understanding of consequences of this kind of sorrow related to conception, but I think I'm going to give you some statistics here in a moment that might shock you a little bit as it relates to this. So just be prepared. Something as we look through the data here. So certainly in our century, cultural norms have shifted greatly even in the most recent decades. From what they were from the ancient world, where a woman's defining achievement was and source of esteem was in being a mother. Now, we got plenty of very narcissistic people, and I'm not trying to say anybody who doesn't have kids is narcissistic, but we have plenty of people who openly declare, I don't want kids. I want to travel, and I want freedom, and they openly declare, I don't want to be a parent. That would never be a phrase that you would have heard uttered by somebody living in ancient biblical times. For a woman always wanted her identity to be associated with having a plethora of offspring. Okay, it was just, that's how it was. Her self-esteem was defined by that. Bearing many children was a multiplication of the blessing. She felt blessed as a woman the more children that she had. That was just the way. It's being fruitful and multiply. That's the command God gave to Adam and Eve in the garden, and that's how virtually all of humanity, women in humanity, felt as a general historical rule. They wanted to be a childbearer. They wanted to be a mother. And a woman who could not bear children was looked upon with contempt in society and may very well be replaced by her husband if she was not giving him children. Okay, it was a very common way of either he's going to add to his harem by polygamy, or he's going to get rid of the unfruitful woman and find one who is fruitful. It was so important in the culture that a man would have an heir and that the woman would feel blessed by having children to give to her husband and to the family. Okay. But having said that, because certainly things have transitioned in our current culture, where a lot of people still have children, and some people can't have children, but some people choose in a somewhat narcissistic way to say, I don't want children, I won't have children. But I want you to see some of these rates here, or miscarriage rates. Okay, so even today, these miscarriage rates you might consider to be astonishingly high. So I looked at some studies, having heard some of this stuff anecdotally in the past. I looked at some studies this week, and one recent study estimated that 70 to 75% of fertilized eggs do not survive to implantation in the uterus. They're fertilized, but they don't actually implant. Okay, that's 3 out of 4 don't implant. In every pregnancy situation, okay? So they are fertilized, and I, along with many pro-life people, would say that life begins at fertilization. And so you've got a huge number, three out of 4 babies who are born, or what's going to be worse than that, 3 out of 4 babies who have eggs that are fertilized don't actually implant. That's obviously, to me, a result of the fall. Okay, we're living in a fallen world. And many people, many women struggle with obviously fertility issues, they desire greatly to be a mother and to get pregnant, and they struggle with fertility issues. That statistic doesn't help. Then after the fertilization, another 31% of successfully implanted in the woman's uterus eggs do end in miscarriage. Now, that's a huge number as well, but here's the point. Most women, unless they somehow found a way to test for this, have no idea that they have miscarried that level of fertilized eggs. Okay? Most of them don't know until it's much further into the process. First fertilized and then implanted. Okay? And I'm not trying to make anybody feel like sad or guilty or whatever about all the babies you may have lost along the way, husbands or wives. But this is just statistically what they have found in their research, is that a huge number of eggs that are fertilized don't implant, and roughly 1/3 of implanted eggs still miscarried. Okay. Then once a pregnancy is really far enough along to register medically, like the woman in the medical community knows that she's actually pregnant, the miscarriage rate is another 10 to 20%, so let's say 15%, average in the first trimester. Okay. And then finally, the miscarriage rates drop to about 4% in the final 2 trimesters of pregnancy. So based on that, compiling all that together, about 13.5 out of 100 fertilized eggs make it to full term. Okay. And that doesn't include, obviously, the tragic statistics on abortion, the 60 million babies that have been aborted in our nation since Roe v. Wade. So does that not sort of describe the kind of toil and struggle for women to be fertilized, especially if you transition that back into a culture that highly valued pregnancy after pregnancy after pregnancy, giving the husband the full quiver of children that she possibly could? That is greatly multiplying the sorrow in just the conception process, just fertilizing the egg. It's probably getting worse. My guess is it's getting worse over time because of the fall. But nevertheless, we read about women in the Old Testament times who desired children for their husband, even like Sarah, who required a miraculous, fertilization process in order for her at age 90 to conceive Isaac. So there is this, we see it, meaning it is true. Okay, it was true in ancient times, and it hasn't really changed in modern times. With all of our treatments and all of our skills, we've still seen incredibly high sorrow rates. Should make us sorry that 14 or 13 out of 100 children actually make it through that process. That's sorrowful. And that's exactly what God said would happen to Eve and all women following. So the consequences of the fall in the human genetic code, I believe, are the primary cause for this low success rate among fertilized eggs. Each generation sees a greater level of genetic deterioration as humanity moves further and further away from the perfect DNA that Adam and Eve had 6,000 years ago in the garden. Okay? We see that. We can see that we can genetically trace the mitochondrial DNA for women and the Y chromosome for men. We can see there's about, whatever it is, 100 or so copying errors as you go from parent to offspring. Okay? And just generation after generation after generation, that's been happening, which is another indicator of a not very old Earth, because if humans have lived for 100,000 years, that genetic deterioration would make us unviable as a species at this point. Okay, but so far we're still living in the sweet zone, or the butter zone of being able to still produce children. But I think it's getting worse generation after generation after generation. I know it is, because that's what genetic testing has demonstrated to us.
Scott, have they done any testing on DNA and losing like on flies or something like that?
I can't quote anything specific. They have done, like fruit flies, they have done generation after generation after generation after generation after generation of fruit flies, because you can get a new generation every 4 or 5 days or whatever, right? What, of course, they found is there's no variability. They're still coming out fruit flies, thousands of generations later. But I believe, and I can't quote a study on it, but I do believe that you would see that there is a deterioration of the genetic code even in the animal species, yeah. So, yeah. All right, so that's first consequence for women, for Eve and all womankind, the sorrow in conception. Followed by, once you do conceive, there's going to be pain in childbirth. Notice the related components of this, how it defines historically women's role in society. Sorrow in conception, pain in childbirth. I don't have to describe that to anybody, do I? That there's pain in childbirth? Okay. Consequence number 3, has nothing to do necessarily with bearing children, but it does have to do with a headship conflict in the home. He says the woman will desire to take the God-given authority from her husband. Your desire shall be for your husband's role as the head of the home. Okay? However, God will not change his established order, so there's going to be tension. God says, you're going to have a sinful desire to take authority over your home. I'm not going to change the order, so you're going to have this struggle in your own heart, and that's going to rage for womankind, and it's certainly accelerated in our 20th century and 21st century. But so despite the women's wishes, the woman may wish, I think I could rule the house better than my husband. I think I should be the appointed leader. I think I should take the headship. She may have all those wishes or desires, but the man will retain, according to God's design, the authority over the home, as long as he's, of course, properly submitted to obeying God, which we see far, far, far less in our modern society, of people willing to actually take Genesis 3 or any other part of the scriptures that talk about the headship in the home. But that's because this struggle is still going on. And notice, I think all 3 of those consequences are still operating today. We have sorrow in conception, we have pain in childbirth, and we have turmoil in who's supposed to lead the home when we're not dealing with people submitted to the authority of God's word. So those consequences, far from like evaporating because of our great advancement in technology and as a society, okay, they still represent significant and challenges for really all women. And they've not gone away in 6,000 years. We're still dealing with the same things. It ought to be a strong testimony that God knows what he's doing and saying and telling Eve, these are consequences for your choice. Now, if you think that's bad, that women will have struggle with conception, have pain during the childbirth process, or desire to have authority in their home that God hasn't given them, well, think about the man. He's not skating off any easier and probably worse in some ways for his role in this first original sin and for how he and all of his side of the human population, the male side, have to deal with. So as I said, with Eve, God didn't curse Eve, but he did describe consequences for her choices. For Adam, he specifically curses the ground that Adam was made from and is going to be forced to work in and is going to return to when he dies. So the ground is cursed, but Adam, of course, thankfully, as part of humanity, the head of all humanity, wasn't cursed. So Adam and all mankind is not cursed directly as the serpent was, but will experience a great deal of consequences by living in the cursed world that came to be because he sinned in the garden. And unlike Eve, we didn't see this with Eve, God recounts Adam's transgressions, his sins in detail. So he didn't say, woman, because you were deceived and took of the eat tree. He didn't say that. He just said, he asked the woman what she did. Then he says, this is the consequences for what is a result of your sin. Adam gets his wrongdoings recounted for him. Okay, so Adam was wrong, God says, for heeding the voice of his wife. Recognize God's, here's the reason, here's the problem that God is pointing out. God's voice and God's commandments must come first. Okay? A man, being the head of his home, must listen to God first, wife second. Just the way it is. Now, listening to a woman's voice is not sinful. Okay? Unless her words conflict with God's. That's the problem. Okay? God is not saying never have a conversation with your wife. If your wife says A, then always do B. He's not saying that. He's saying you can't let her words override the commands that God has given, that I've given to you as your creator and the one who has authority over you. Yeah, Liz.
Just thinking it depends if you don't value listening to your wife's voice, you're going to hear it over and over.
One wonders, is this why us husbands have such a hard time hearing the wife's voice? Because we were told by God that we were in trouble when we listened to our wife's voice. I don't know. All have the same problem. All right. So again, this is not your voice has no say in the marriage, has no say in the raising of the children, has no say in what you do as a family. It's saying she can't have authority over what God has given as a commandment. Okay, so man was granted leadership and authority in their home, in the relationship between the husband and wife, Adam and Eve, and he should have protected his wife from the cunning deceitfulness of the serpent, but he failed in his role as leader and protector. Right? He listened to her rather than protecting her. He listened to her rather than obeying God. That's a fault that Adam is charged with here. And of course, he ate from the tree, which God had certainly commanded him not to do. So God is recounting that you ate, and here's the consequences for your poor decision, your sinful choice. So, man, that excuse that Adam gave of the woman you gave to me, she gave me the fruit and I ate, right? He can't legitimately blame his wife for his own actions. God says, you ate, you're going to suffer the consequences. Okay? Notice how God strips away the excuses, the attempt to shift or defer blame. God says, you ate, here's your consequences. Now, Paul stated that Adam, as I said last week, and again here in 1 Timothy 2, that Adam was not deceived. What Adam did, he did knowing full well that it was wrong, and it would bring the consequence of death into his life and really into all of humanity. Okay. Eve's actions, whether out of ignorance... Oh, did you have a question?
I had a question about Adam. I agree he was aware of that, but what could have possibly been his motive if he was aware of the destructiveness of it? Why do it in the first place? It just,
yeah, so why would Adam eat not being deceived? We can only speculate, of course, because Scripture doesn't tell us specifically. But it may have been just a heart of rebellion in a person who is a free will agent, can make his own choices and say, I'm not deceived, but I want to try this thing anyway. Any more than you or I might not be deceived that, that some kind of sin, whatever it may be, is wrong, but we're like, I want it anyway. I don't care that God told me it's no. I know it's not being deceived, it's making a legitimate choice to enjoy the pleasures of sin rather than obeying God and refusing or denying ourselves that supposed pleasure. Okay, so it may be that. I've heard some people, Chuck Missler talks about it and stuff, that try to describe it as an act of love for Eve. Like, Eve ate, and he's like, oh, you ate. We're going to be separate now, and we're one flesh. I can't be separated from you. Well, if you've done it, then I have to do it because I would rather be with you than with God. This kind of sense of I love my wife so much that I will choose the same bad choice that she made. And there's other speculations that go along with it. What's clear, though, Adam didn't think I'll gain something good and godlike out of it. He knew it was wrong. He made the choice, and he probably knew there would be consequences. But like most of us, we downplay the consequences before the act, and then we recognize how horrible of a choice we made after the act. I think that probably would describe Adam. He just downplayed the consequences into his own mind, not being deceived by the words of the serpent, just in his own mind saying, well, I'm going to give it a try anyway. Okay, just so curious, just so rebellious in his heart.
Unfortunately, it seems like that's the very first time he actually had a consequence that he had to deal with.
Sure, I think it's true. That would be the very first time a consequence, because there was only one rule in the garden: don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he chose to eat from that and immediately suffered the consequences from it. So really the bottom line is that Adam was at fault. He willfully disobeyed God's command to him, and he brought sin, death, and rebellion into the world as a result. So let's get to the consequences. That's God giving Adam a review of what he did. God for Adam cursed the ground because of Adam. He didn't curse Adam, he cursed the ground. So that's the first curse. Second consequence is that God created Adam for Adam the work that God created for Adam to do now transformed into toil. So the Hebrew word there is isabon, and the work went from a source of satisfaction. I'm going to tend and keep the garden. I'm going to be satisfied. This is truly satisfying. It's not laborious. It doesn't wear me out. It doesn't make me go, I don't want to go to work today. It was enjoyable. It was now transformed into toil. Okay? The work went from a source of true satisfaction to a need for survival and in struggle, including things like it's going to cause, because it's a toil, it has connotations like suffering and hardship and sharp pain, very intense, expending consubstantial energy. These were not things that the garden was originally designed with. But the word toil there that God says you're going to toil all the days of your life means that there's going to be suffering as part of life, and you're not going to be able to get away from it. There's going to be hardship associated with life, and you're not going to be able to get away from it. It's going to be painful. It's going to be intense work. It's going to require a substantial, expending of energy, and you're not going to feel like you can refill the tank as well as you could before the fall. Okay. It also includes things like anxiety from failed crops. Well, what if these crops fail this year? What am I going to eat next season if the crops don't come in? Okay. And knowing that I'm responsible for providing for my family. These are highly anxiety-inducing kind of thoughts now that you don't live in a perfect world. So that's the concept of toiling from the cursed ground. And the cursed earth and all of the hardships that cursing brings to the earth will endure until God restores all things at the end of the age. But there's no end to the toil of work that's required for mankind. Now, of course, some people have great wealth. They've been blessed or not blessed, or whatever you want to call it, with great wealth, and they live off their parents' trust fund or whatever. But as a whole, mankind, 6,000 years later, still toils in work to pay the bills, to get food on the table, to deal with the consequences in life. Sure, there's a elect few who maybe never, ever have to worry about such a thing in their entire life. But mankind, I think you would say, if you tour the world, and whether you go tour Haiti or Africa or Asia, you're going to find all kinds of people in great toil trying to just survive. America, we don't quite have it as bad for the most part, but you can still go downtown and see that kind of toiling going on. But as a whole, for 6,000 years, mankind has struggled to just put the basic necessities on the table. Consequence number 4, the ground will now bring forth thorns and thistles. Well, that doesn't seem to ever have been there before. Okay? Or if they were, they certainly were not a problem. So thorns and thistles did not exist, or they posed no inconvenience. Now they're going to be a significant detriment to man's ability to provide the basic necessities for his family, because they're going to compete for the crops. Thorns will grow easily, and crops will grow with much toil. Okay? This is just part of the fact. In fact, man will be in a constant battle to eliminate thorns and thistles, which so easily grow, and he's going to struggle to plant the things that he needs for his care. I mean, If I wanted to grow weeds, I'd have no problem whatsoever growing weeds on this property or in my yard. If I want to grow grass or trees or anything else, it's like, right? Always a struggle. Okay. So there's going to be this competition in the land for the good stuff versus the stuff that is highly undesirable, that's easily growable. Consequence number 5, herbs previously given in abundance for food will be a constant source of work and worry for the man. Some people will even starve to death because of resource scarcity, which, if we look back historically, most scarcity seasons were brought about by man's own actions. But it doesn't matter. It's all part of the curse. It's all part of the fact that we're going to compete for these scarce resources, and man is constantly going to be in toil trying to put food on the table and deal with the necessities of life. Number 6, consequence, man will work hard enough to produce sweat. I'm guessing Adam never sweat before. He was working, he's doing whatever God did. And again, we don't know if this is hours or days or maybe months, but whatever it was, Adam would never went, wow, sweat. Okay. Now he's going to be sweat from his brow, perhaps as though he is never really getting anywhere. That feeling of, I just keep planting and I keep sowing and I keep harvesting and I feel like I'm barely making it, and then I got to start all over again and do the same thing. I'm just not getting ahead, right? Each new season seems to have the same challenges as the season before it. You got to keep overcoming. Am I going to get enough water? Am I going to beat the frost layer? Am I going to be able to harvest in time? Or am I going to have insects or parasites or anything else that are going to destroy my crop? There's this constant battle, right? Over and over and over again for the sweat of the brow, trying to get the food on the table. Oops, should be number 7. Consequence number 7, death of the physical body. There's going to be a consequence of death. Now, isn't it interesting? God is so poetic at times. God formed man from the dust of the ground, and while death was not an instantaneous consequence, he's going back to the dust in the end. Okay? So without God, man is just a bunch of highly organized dust particles, right? It may look like lungs and hearts and livers and blood cells and all that, but we're really just a bunch of highly organized dust particles. We can prove that because when we die, we go right back to where we started, as dust. Okay? So when death occurs, the body will return to the form from which it came, which is dust. Death is now an inescapable enemy. Paul calls it the last enemy in 1 Corinthians. As a consequence of man's sin. Constantly a battle, how am I going to survive? God has put, really, in most of us, a strong survival instinct, just like he does with most animals, strong survival instinct, and we're constantly trying to fend off the grim reaper, trying to fend off going back to dust. So, but we're constantly in battle with this enemy. That death wants us, and we're trying to keep it alive as long as we can. So death is not going to be instantaneous. Adam understood that, whether before or after eating of the forbidden fruit. But as a result, death has now entered into human condition where it never existed before. In fact, each day Adam now lived from this moment of the eating of the forbidden fruit in the garden was now really a slow progression back towards its dustful origins, right? Now, for him, it was 930 years, but there was this slow progression of death, decay, aging that's going to get him in the end, not including the consequences of walking off a cliff or getting torn apart by an animal or having Cain murder Abel, right? There's all these consequences or all these ways that now death and returning to dust can come to man. All right. So that ends the whole section of cursing, okay, in terms of the serpent was cursed, Eve was told of her consequences. For Adam, the ground was cursed, and we see all of the consequences for that. So then as we close out the chapters, a few points left over. Okay. Adam called his wife Eve. First time we've seen her name. I know I keep using it here and there. Sometimes I say woman, sometimes I say Eve. But she hadn't been named yet until after the fall. Okay. It was because she was the mother of all living or all humanity, he says there in verse 20 of chapter 3. Now this, I believe, is scientifically affirmed, is obvious today, meaning that Adam and Eve were the original parents of all humanity. Okay. But there were, and that was always assumed until like Darwin and some of those evolutionary kind of mindsets. But, you hear about from Darwin and going forward, the cradle of civilization, and there were these different population groups, and we think where there's different races of human beings, and they came from different tribes, and, just this explosion of different humanoids that popped into existence. That's what evolutionary hypothesis said for 150 years or so. But those are all speculations in the secular world. All should have been basically were wiped out when we got to the Human Genome Project in basically the year 2000, where they came through and they basically certainly concluded, hey, we had no idea, but all human beings come from a single Adam and Eve. They even call them that original set of parents. Oh, interesting, right? So the Bible declares that Eve is the mother of all living, and therefore Adam is the father of all living. But science rejected that for 100 years plus. And now they're coming back to that, having actually looked at the scientific data from the Human Genome Project. And then I didn't bring the book, but Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, in his book Traced, fairly new book that's out in the last year and a half or so, from Answers in Genesis. He's tracing humans all the way back, not only to Adam and Eve, but also there's another choke point in human, lineage back to the flood of Noah, and he has pretty definitively shown that there's three main branches of the human population from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, something we'll talk about when we get to Genesis chapter 9. Okay. And so we're seeing true scientific confirmation and evidence from all of that. Now, he's using the Y-inherited chromosome, as I mentioned earlier, the Y chromosome, the male inherited gene that traces all the way back. And it's amazing if you've read the book or watched any of the videos from Answers in Genesis, and kind of amazing to see the precision with which you can extrapolate that information backwards. Really quite amazing. All right, so Eve, her name literally means life or living. So she's the mother of all living. And here's what I think is interesting or important to glean from the final closing verses of this chapter. Adam clearly understood that God was not through with him or the human race yet. Right? He was told, in the day that you eat of the fruit, you will die. Not just die, you will surely die. But he understands, God still has a plan for us. I can't escape death, but my wife will be the mother of all living. God's not going to wipe us out and put two new people in the garden. He understood that God was going to populate the world through him and his wife, even though they were sinners and were going to be cast out of the garden in a few seconds. Okay. So Adam and Eve would not only bear a seed, like God promised to Eve, she would bear the seed, but all humans who ever live will trace their lineage back to Eve as their very first mother. This is clearly something Adam understood by naming her that. Okay. So he began to understand the goodness, the grace, and the plan of God, even in the midst of just receiving judgment for his sin. This does not mean that Adam thought he would escape the death penalty, but that he trusted God's words about toil, the toil he would endure. You can't toil if you're dying today, right? So God told him all these things. Well, you're not going to toil all the days of your life. You're going to have sweat of your brow and all that kind of stuff if you're going to die because you ate the fruit. You're going to die because you ate the fruit, but after you toil all the days of your life, after you see that your wife is in sorrow and in pain during childbirth and all those kind of things. So he clearly understood the message. Again, Adam's intelligent. He can pick up on the words that God has said and understand, I have a season of life and then I'm going to die. Not as the serpent, or people try to accuse, well, I thought God said that, he would, in the day he ate of it, he would die. He did. Death entered the world when Adam took that fruit. But God is long-suffering and gracious and wasn't going to start over. He's going to populate the world, even though Adam and Eve sinned, and they're going to have nothing but sin left over. All right, so back to reference to our fig leaf issue. Back now, God is going to provide the true covering for mankind, both physically and symbolically or figuratively, for us to recognize the purpose of this. So the word is created, is not created. Remember back in Genesis 1, we talked about the word bara. Okay, Hebrew word means God spoke something into existence that never existed before. No, he didn't create tunics of skin out of nothing. He manufactured them or fashioned them, which is the Hebrew word asah, which means an animal or two had to die for skins. Okay. There's only one source of skins or hide. God must have sacrificed an animal or two in order to make a proper covering from Adam and Eve. And my guess is he did it right in front of them, demonstrating, showing them that this concept of an innocent animal, innocent blood being shed for the sins of man is then going to be repeated over and over and over and over again. We're going to see that very thing in chapter 4 where Cain and Abel are offering sacrifices to God, and Abel offers an offering of an animal, okay, indicating he's copying what his parents taught him, what God taught them in the garden. And can you imagine, now, remember we talked about how it was sort of esoteric or theoretical, this concept of evil before they ate. Well, now death was esoteric or theoretical because they'd never seen anything die before. When God told them, you're going to die, until he slaughtered a couple of animals, let's say. Can you imagine, having never seen or even fully understood what death is, to see the blood of these animals gushing out and God stripping the hides off of them and forming and fashioning tunics of skin for them to wear? Now they're walking around in that animal that they once cared for's skin, right? Can you imagine the feelings that would evoke in this first couple, having never experienced anything like this before? Okay, I mean, I think God probably did it right in front of them. Let me show you how you're going to now be in relationship to me. You're going to spend the rest of your days also sacrificing animals. They're innocent, they're cute, they're loving, they're whatever, but you're going to slaughter them, you're going to pour out their blood, and you're going to deal with this atonement concept of covering over the sins that you have committed and all mankind has committed. So the blood sacrifice also points, of course, to the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ. All of those very prolific sacrifices in the Old Testament of animals and blood always point to Christ. And so here again in chapter 3, we're seeing a foreshadowing of the work of Christ on the cross, which you wouldn't know by reading Genesis chapter 3 unless you read Genesis, or read all the way through the New Testament, and then now look back at Genesis and say, I see what God is doing in all of these sacrifices and blood and all that's going on there. So certainly Adam and Eve would have been eyewitnesses to this first animal death, and they would see that's what sin costs. That's what God requires and demands in order for me to even have any kind of proper covering for my sin, much less full atonement for my sins. Whether they had any concept that God would send his own son, that seed of the woman, I don't know. But do you not see how Christ is enveloping this entire story in terms of his sacrifice, his work, our relationship to him, and our only ability to be in relationship to God through the blood sacrifice of the seed of the woman? So this event also helps to explain the practice that we see throughout the Old Testament of God requiring animals to be sacrificed, okay, all the way through. And recognize, the Mosaic law that actually prescribes all this was 2,500 years after the garden. But Abel offered an animal sacrifice. Noah offers animal sacrifice. Abraham offers animal sacrifices long, long, long before Moses stood at the base of Mount Sinai. Okay, so this is all instituted by God well before the law. Specifically, God demonstrated that innocent blood must be shed in order to atone for man's sin. That's the lesson, that's the teaching that God is giving them. Innocent blood must be shed in order to atone for or cover over man's sin, and that only God could make the appropriate sacrifice that would be acceptable. Notice God did the shedding of blood. God did the forming of the fashioning of the tunics of skin. God used the blood to create the covering. Okay? God says, I will do it. You can't do it yourself. Okay? Yeah, you'll copy me as a way of reminding yourself of what sin cost and how it's all going to come about. But God will provide for himself the sacrifice. God will provide not just for himself, God will provide himself as the sacrifice for sins. All right, then finally, we are expelled from the garden, the last 3 verses of the book. I don't know, we'll get there. Got 4 minutes, let's try. This is the second conversation between the members of the Trinity recorded in Scripture, right? He's going to make the statement, now man has become like us. We saw that in Genesis 1:26. Now we're going to see God is saying within the Trinity, within the Godhead, man has become like us, knowing good and evil. Now God acknowledges that man has now come to know or experience sin in a way that the animals, let's say, could never know. Okay? He's become like one of us, actually understanding evil and the consequences for sin and all kinds of things that an animal really could never know. Okay? And in this sense, fallen man has added another attribute to his existence, the true knowledge in the experiential sense of evil. God has always known evil, but notice God doesn't need to experience it to know what it is. Okay? So man is like us. He can actually comprehend the true depths of what evil, wicked, sinful things are. So he's kind of like us, but God doesn't have to do evil or be evil to understand evil. Like he told Adam, trust me. That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't do it. You won't like it. God, of course, knows the difference. So God can know evil without committing evil, whereas man, having been told about evil, eventually decide, I have to experience it for myself if I truly want to know what evil is. So God and man have this related understanding of evil. That knowledge came, but the means of their knowledge, God and man's knowledge about evil, comes from very different means. God's come from his full resource of having all knowledge of all things. Man experienced evil directly, and that's the only way he could truly understand what evil was, because he didn't get it when God told him, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Man's violation of God's command brought the knowledge of evil and the reality of death into his own constitution. And now we are all sinners, and we are all born in sin because Adam experienced sin and passed that experience on to us. Therefore, the tree of life, previously unrestricted, it seems, from before the fall, was now the greatest threat to man and to God's plan for man. God had to get man and the tree of life separated, lest man eat from it and be forever subjected to a life of unjudged sin that needs to be dealt with. Okay, God has a bigger plan for man. So if they had taken from the tree of knowledge, a tree of life, it would have resulted in man living forever, but in this unredeemable plan, or unredeemable sin, which was contrary to God's plan. Therefore, Yahweh God, lovingly provided the solution so that fallen man would never partake of the tree of life. So he expels him from the garden and then sets protection around it. Yahweh sent man out where he could live in his fallen mortal state, and he was no longer welcome back in the garden. Now, the tree of life wasn't like ripped up and pulled out. He just protected the tree and made sure man had no access to it. Then God drives or banishes man from having any access to the garden. And then God placed this cherubim at the east of the garden, which is more than one. Cherubim is plural, so more than one cherub, which are incredibly powerful beings, not the little babies with wings, right? Powerful beings to keep man out. And some have speculated keeping Satan out as well, lest Satan somehow go and try to give man, that's why you probably multiple cherubs are standing there, to protect the tree from Satan doing malicious things once again against God's plans for humanity. So he puts this flaming sword, it says that turned in every direction to protect the tree of life. God is intensely protective of the tree of life. We won't see it again until Revelation chapter 22. So let's see, from man foolishly taking from the tree. So what's he protecting us from? From man foolishly taking from the tree of life and then being separated from God forever. Man's already made one really foolish decision. Let's not compound it by making a worse one. From the serpent, as I said, who might try to destroy man again. And notice how the best thing, I think this is just poetic. Notice that the best thing the garden had to offer man before, the tree of life, becomes the most dangerous and harmful thing for man after sin. It was the best thing, eternal life, until sin came. Now it's the most dangerous thing that man could possibly endure, so God protects man from this. This testifies to the degree which sin and wickedness bring harm into the world. The best thing became the worst thing. Not that there's something wrong with the tree of life, but if man takes it, if you and I take it in our state now, we're stuck in our sin and rebellion and get judged for it. God offers us something better to get back to the tree of life, but we have to come back out of our sin into the fullness of forgiveness in order to get access to it. So I'll finish with this. Christians should learn a great lesson about the cost of sin from Genesis chapter 3. We should learn about death, and that death is separation from God. We should recognize that what we thought was freedom restricted is actually freedom lost when we add sin to something. We're not gaining, freedom, we're losing freedom when we engage in sin. Blessings and restrictions are removed. Restricted or blessings are the blessings that God had desired for mankind had to be restricted or removed from us once sin entered into man's life. What kind of things in our life, if we sin, why we receive God's blessing restricted or removed from us if we don't get sin under control? Offspring is corrupted. If I sin, my offspring can be corrupted by my choices. Suffering of the innocent, the animals that lost their life because of my sin. The innocent suffer when man chooses sin. And other parts are only God can provide the solution. Man's attempts to fix his own problem through false religion are always insufficient. Exposure to the evil that God desired to protect man. God wants to protect us. Sin allows the wicked, evil things that God didn't want us to experience, allows them into our life. If we restrict sin, God can keep those things away from us, the consequences from it. Exposure to the evil that God desired to protect man from. Hiding with fear and trembling at the presence of God because we sin. And then we end up with shame and blame because of our choice to sin. I think we can learn a lot from the story or the account of sin in the garden and how it applies to us. Not just Adam and Eve. Oh, let's curse Adam and Eve because they left us in this condition. Let's learn the lesson that they are teaching us through the text. Have a good evening.